Let me make a few comments to you about the material we covered in the reading for week 3. There's much more to be said than I'm going to say in this video, but it is important to hit some of the highlights. Let me start out though with some course administration matters. First of all, on the quizzes, I've realized that many of you, because of your work schedules, have difficulty taking the quiz between Monday and Friday when I've had them open thus far. So I'm going to extend all of the quizzes from here on out to be open until 10 p.m. on Sunday night. And that'll give you some time over the weekend to take them if the weekend is when you need to do your work. Also, I want to call your attention to the poll question that I'm going to put up on week 3. I'm asking you to tell me which version of Stein's book you're using, 1994 or 2011. I suspect that there are a lot of you, maybe all of you, that are using 2011. And if that's the case, I'll just stop referencing 1994. So tell me which version you're using on that question that'll be listed on the class website. Also, just wanted to say to you, I know that ideally we would have more time for lecture and time for you to respond to what I say with questions and clarifications and discussions. Because I know there are many points that could be amplified, and there are many times when I don't speak clearly or I misspeak. So I thank you for bearing with me in this format. I know that limitations on all of us just make this the best way to do a class sometime. But now let's jump into the content. Chapter 4 makes a very important point, and that is that different passages in the Bible have different literary forms or genres. And you have to understand the literary form of a passage in order to interpret it correctly. In fact, understanding the literary form often makes all the difference. I don't know if you've ever seen a drawing of the woman described in Song of Solomon. I don't have a copy of it to show you, but I just know I've seen a drawing of the picture of the Shulamite woman in Song of Solomon. And the drawing is ridiculous. It has teeth like sheep and eyes like doves, as Solomon describes the woman. And it's kind of making light of this description as if to say, what kind of description of a woman is this? This is not a beautiful woman, this is a funny-looking woman. Well, I know that the drawing is intended partly as a joke, but I think it kind of misses the point that Song of Solomon is in the genre of poetry. It's not narrative, so we're not supposed to take the descriptions literally and assume that the woman actually had eyes that look like doves and teeth that look like sheep. Let me read you a couple of verses and show you what I mean from Song of Solomon. This is Song of Solomon chapter 4, the first couple of verses. Behold, you are beautiful, my love. Behold, you are beautiful. Your eyes are doves behind your veil. Your hair is like a flock of goats sleeping down the slopes of Gilead. Your teeth are like a flock of shorn ewes that have come up from the washing, all of which bear twins. Not one among them has lost its young. And that chapter goes on. And if you misunderstand the genre, if you think it's just a narrative giving a literal description, you're going to badly miss the point. It's poetry, not to be taken literally, but to evoke emotion and to get at a meaning behind the symbolism. There's another example of where misunderstanding the genre results in misunderstanding the passage. And by the way, I'm using the word genre. I don't remember if Stein uses that word, but it's a common word when you're talking about biblical interpretation, and it just means the literary form or the style of a certain passage. So you'll hear me using that word, and that's what it means, and it's a fine word for you to use too, just because it's faster to say than literary form. But recently there was a scholar named Mike Licona who wrote a book defending the resurrection of Jesus. I haven't read it, but from what I understand it's a fine book, but there was some controversy over it because of the way he interpreted a passage in Matthew 27. Matthew 27 verses 51 through 53. And here's what it says. It's talking about when Jesus died on the cross. It says, "And behold, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom, and the earth shook, and rocks were split. The tombs also were opened, and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. And coming out of the tombs after his resurrection, they went into the holy city and appeared to many." Well, Mike Licona suggested in his book that the bodies of saints may not actually have been raised. And he said this language is actually a poetic device. But the problem with that interpretation is that this is not a poetic passage. This is a biblical narrative passage. And in a biblical narrative passage, unless there's some obvious clue, we're to take the details literally, not figuratively. And so it seems to me it's a misinterpretation to say when Matthew tells us that the bodies of believers were raised at Jesus' death, it's wrong for us to say, well, that's just a poetic device. This isn't a poetic passage. But misunderstanding the genre here can result in a significant misinterpretation of the Bible. This made me think of the fact that there seem to be a lot of Christians who think it a good thing to say, I always interpret the Bible literally. Now, that may not be the best statement to make. If they simply mean, I take it seriously and I interpret the Bible to mean what the authors intended, well, that's fine. But if they take it to mean, I interpret all the words with wooden literalism, then that seems to me that's not a good statement to make, because to always take the Bible literally is to misunderstand the literary genres in which it is written. If the author wrote in a style that's intended to be taken literally, like the Gospel of Matthew, well, we take the words literally. But it's a mistake to take all of the words literally if we're reading a passage like Song of Solomon, where the author never intended for the words to be taken literally. Maybe a better thing to say would be, we take the Bible seriously and we interpret it as the author intended for it to be interpreted, based on the literary style he chose. Because literal understanding of the words is not always what the genre demands. Well, I hope that point's clear to you, because that's the foundation for really the rest of what we're going to talk about in the section of this course where we use Stein's book. Let's talk a little bit about the specific literary genres that we've gone over this week. First of all, narrative. Biblical narrative is a type of writing that tells a story, a true story, in plain everyday language. And there's a lot to say about it, but an important point is that the meaning of a biblical narrative is what the author willed to teach by telling the story. You can think of it this way. Stein says, if you asked Mark about a given passage, why did you tell us this story? The meaning of the passage would be Mark's reply when he says, I told you this story because. And the answer would generally be, because I wanted you to understand thus and such about Jesus for the Gospel of Mark. Stein lists several clues that help you to determine a narrative's meaning, and those are very important. You'll be tested on those, and more than that, in your study of the Bible for the rest of your life, those are crucial in understanding what a narrative is about. But a common mistake in interpreting biblical narrative is to ask merely, what character am I supposed to imitate, rather than asking, why did the author tell this story? Let me give you a couple of examples that I think will ring true as soon as you hear them. Think of the story of David and Goliath. How many Bible studies have you been in, or how many sermons have you heard, where the teacher basically said that the point of David and Goliath is to be courageous like David? Well, if you ask the author of 1 Samuel, where that story is, in 1 Samuel 17, why did you tell us the story of David and Goliath? It seems pretty clear that the answer would not be, I told you that story so you could see what it's like to be brave in the face of great obstacles. That's a peripheral lesson that we can learn from the story, but it seems clear from the context that the point of the story is to show that David is better qualified than Saul to be the king of Israel and the champion of God's people. In the chapter before, 1 Samuel 16, David is anointed as king privately. And then we also see in that section of 1 Samuel that Saul begins to fall into sin. And to see David step forward in faith and defeat Goliath at the same time that we see Saul back down and not fight Goliath and begin to sin in other ways, well, it highlights that David is qualified to be the leader and champion of God's people, and Saul is not. And that's how it's functioning in the story. And it seems like if we could ask the author, why did you tell that story? That's what he would say. He wouldn't say, well, the point is to tell you that if you take courage amidst your great obstacles, you will win. That's true. God does want us to have courage and faith. But that's not why, primarily, the author told us that story. A New Testament example. Think about the feeding of the 5,000. I'm thinking in particular of the version of that account in John chapter 6, verses 1 through 13. And how many times have you heard it preached or taught that the point of that passage is that we should be like the little boy and share the small resources we have because God can do great things with them. Once again, that's completely true and biblical to say we should share the little resources we have and God can do great things with them. But if you ask John, why did you tell the story of the feeding of the 5,000? I don't think he would say, well, I told you that story to remind you to share your small resources so God can do big things with them. In fact, it was pointed out to me one time that that story doesn't say anything about whether the boy shared his loaves and fishes willingly. They could have had to pry them from his hands while he kicked and screamed for all we know. But if you start to look at the contextual clues in that passage, and in the book of John, you see that the reason John told that story was to tell us that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, who has all power and who we should believe in. Well, I was going to say I won't go there in the interest of time, but if you have a Bible, flip to John 6 for a minute, and I'll show you what I mean when I say the point of the passage is something else. You look in verse 14 of John 6, it's some dialogue, and it says, when the people saw the sign that he had done, they said, this is indeed the prophet who has come into the world. So that's a clue, that Jesus' identity and power is the point of the passage. And then you go to some interesting verses later on in the chapter, verses 30 and 31, and you have crowds who come to Jesus a little later, and it says, so they said to him, then what sign do you do that we may see and believe you? What work do you perform? Our fathers ate the manna in the wilderness. As it is written, he gave them bread from heaven to eat. What an interesting thing. The crowds come to Jesus right after the feeding of the 5,000. And they say to him, what sign are you going to do so that we'll believe that you are the Son of God? The Old Testament people believed because God sent bread from heaven miraculously and provided bread where they needed it. Jesus, what sign are you going to do so that we'll believe you are the Christ, the Son of God? And how ironic that the people thought they needed another sign, and in fact they wanted a sign like God did when he sent bread miraculously in the Old Testament. They didn't even realize that God had just sent bread miraculously, and the one that provided it was the Son of God. That's the point of the feeding of the 5,000. And the other thing may be a valuable lesson, but it's not the meaning of the passage. So you see my general drift there, and you see how we can misinterpret biblical narrative by drawing valid principles, but acting like those are the main point. The main point of a narrative is what the author wanted to teach us by telling that story, not just a moral example to follow from the story. Now, consider the form of covenants and laws. I'm not going to dwell on these, but I do want you to note the point that Stein makes, that biblical covenants are patterned after ancient Near Eastern suzerainty covenants. And this was a covenant where a lord unilaterally established conditions and blessings and curses for a subject. That's what the that's what the Old Testament covenants are. They are God, the Lord, unilaterally telling his people what they must do to receive his blessing and what they can do to receive his curses. It's not a covenant between equals where one party says, I'll do this for you if you do this for me, and they have equal pull. It is like a suzerainty covenant. See Stein on that, because that's an important point. It's also an important point that the Old Testament covenants, the biblical covenants, are gracious covenants. God didn't have to allow his subjects an opportunity for obedience and blessing, but he did. And the fact that he did that highlights his grace and his mercy. As for laws, note the threefold division of the law that Stein describes on page 105 of the 2011 edition of the book. There are other good things he says about laws, but if you study the Bible any amount of time, you'll come across people referring to this threefold division of the law. What they mean by that is that we can divide up the Old Testament laws into three categories. Ethical laws, think of the Ten Commandments, timeless ethical principles. Then cultic laws, laws about Old Testament religious acts, like how to ordain priests and how to prepare sacrifices, and then civil laws. Old Testament Israel's civil laws about what punishments go with what crime and how the king should be selected. That threefold division is important because the New Testament understands the cultic and civil laws no longer to be binding. When Christ came, those passed away. I think of Galatians and Hebrews as books that Stein mentions on that point. And even Acts, when God shows Peter the vision of a sheep coming down from heaven with animals that were unclean under Jewish laws. And God tells Peter to take and eat these things. You look at New Testament passages like that, and it becomes pretty clear that God intended for the ethical Old Testament laws to still be binding on us under the New Covenant, but the cultic and civil laws no longer to be binding. That's a point that we could go into at great detail, and you may want to explore that on your own. But at the very least, I want you to know that threefold division and understand what people mean when they talk about it. Now, just because the cultic and civil laws are no longer binding doesn't mean that they don't express valid principles that will still serve us well if we obey them today. I mean, for instance, the Old Testament principle of an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, I think, has gotten a lot of bad publicity when it's a good principle. We no longer punish people the same way that Old Testament Israel did. But the point, the principle behind that verse is that the punishment should fit the crime. An eye for an eye. So in other words, proportionate punishment. If somebody shoplifts a pack of gum from the supermarket, we don't throw them in jail for 20 years. And in the same way, if someone murders someone else in cold blood, we don't give them a $100 fine. Eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth is a principle that just nations should uphold in their punishment for crimes. So that's a principle from the Old Testament civil law that still holds true, even though the actual civil and cultic laws for the Old Testament are no longer binding, since the nation of Israel doesn't exist as it did in the Old Testament. The final, well, not the final form, but the final major form I want to talk about is poetry. Poetry in most newer translations of the Bible is set off with indentation. So, for instance, I have an ESV here, and if I just flip through it, I can see, for instance, in 2 Chronicles, this is narrative. It's just blocks of text. But then if I flip over to Psalms, you'll see the text looks very different on the page. It's indented and set off, and that's to let me know that it's poetry. That's one advantage of using a newer translation like the ESV or the NIV or something else rather than, say, the King James Version, because these newer versions, by the way the type is set, will tip you off that a passage is poetry. Remember, again, that in poetry not all language is literal, and see Stein's examples on that because they're very helpful. But the point I want to cover with you is parallelism. Parallelism is the most important feature of biblical poetry. It's the rhythmic balance between the lines. Whereas English poetry uses rhyme to have a rhythm between the lines, Old Testament poetry, in particular Hebrew poetry, used parallelism, similar rhythm, and then there are different ways that the lines relate. There's antithetical parallelism, which is the most common type of parallelism in the Bible, and that's where the second line contrasts with the first. Stein gives examples of this, and I'm not going to talk about this with you other than what I've said, because antithetical parallelism is generally not difficult to interpret. But there's another kind of parallelism that is also common, synonymous parallelism. And for me personally, learning about synonymous parallelism really helped me interpret the Bible and opened it up a whole lot. In synonymous parallelism, the second line of the poetry essentially repeats the same thought as the first line. And sometimes, by recognizing a passage as synonymous parallelism, you can interpret the passage much more readily, and something that seemed obscure actually becomes clear. So, for instance, in Matthew chapter 7, this is in the Sermon on the Mount, verses 7 and 8. Jesus says, "Ask and it will be given to you. Seek and you will find. Knock and it will be opened to you. For everyone who asks receives, and the one who seeks finds, and to the one who knocks it will be opened." You could spend a long time trying to figure out what is the difference between asking, seeking, and knocking. But I think Stein is right when he says this is an example of biblical poetry where there's synonymous parallelism. Jesus seems to be saying three things in poetic form that all mean the same thing. And that helps us interpret what it is to ask, seek, and to knock. It's to pray, and to pray with persistence. Another example is in the Psalms. And in fact, before I made this video, I just quickly flipped through the Psalms because they're everywhere in the Psalms. And sometimes you can realize what lines mean by recognizing them as synonymous parallelism. So, Psalm 32 in verse 1, for instance. "Blessed is the one whose transgression is forgiven, whose sin is covered." You could spend a lot of time trying to think about, well, what's the difference between your transgression being forgiven and your sin covered? But if you know that synonymous parallelism is a form that exists in Hebrew poetry, then you pretty quickly recognize that verse as synonymous parallelism. He's just saying the same thing two different ways. Then Psalm 38, for instance, if you just turn over a couple of pages in your Bible, Psalm 38, verse 1, another example of synonymous parallelism. "O Lord, rebuke me not in your anger, nor discipline me in your wrath." The same thought being repeated in different ways in two lines. Then you go to verse 2 of the same psalm and you see it again. "For your arrows have sunk into me, and your hand has come down on me." Same thing being repeated twice. Just try opening your Bible to Isaiah or Psalms or some poetic book and look for examples of synonymous parallelism. You can find other types of parallelism too, but like I said, I find that recognizing synonymous parallelism starts to make what seems to be obscure more clear. The beauty of studying all these things, these genres and how to interpret them, is that it makes a lot of things that start out obscure to be very clear. And that's really the point of reading the Word of God. It's to understand what God inspired the authors to communicate so that we can internalize it and believe it, and it'll change our lives. On the final form that we studied, the Psalms, I'll just refer you to Stein's discussion of the Psalms rather than burdening you by repeating it, because it is important to know the different kinds of Psalms, and I will test you on that. If any of this is unclear, or if you have any other questions, please email me, and if I need to even address them on a future lecture video, I'll do that. But I hope and I pray that these things that we study sink in your mind, but also enrich your personal walk with God.